Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Trent, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ashutosh. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Trent is the founder and director at Frontier ASEAN, private equity fund manager, emerging markets investment advisor in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. So Trent, before we talk private equity, tell me a little bit about your own amazing journey and what was your motivation to base yourself in Cambodia?
A few things came together, I guess, and ultimately when I moved to Phnom Penh back in 2000, it was almost on a whim in terms of how quickly it happened. But I got the Asia bug pretty early, I guess. My family moved from Australia to the UK when I was still at high school, and that was the first time I'd left Australia. We had a stopover in Singapore, and I'd been learning Bahasa at school. And so that was just an eye-opener for me, an experience of Asia, this in the mid to late 80s, I guess, and being able to speak someone else's language a little bit to them. And I guess I got the bug. And then, over the years, having been then based in the UK, I just took really every school break, every uni break, every opportunity I could to get back and travel in the region. Initially in the Bahasa countries, if you will, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, but and then slowly up into the more Indochina region, Myanmar over the years, and just grew a real love for the area and the people. But also got to know some of the difficult histories that some parts of it have, and to see firsthand some of the development challenges. So that was that primed it, I guess. And then, I'd been with Bain & Company in strategy consulting in Africa and back in the London office for a while, and then Australia. And I love that. I love sort of business analytics and promoting investment, I guess, is what we were doing. But just felt a need at some point to get off the 35th floor and find something a little more kind of personally rewarding, a little more impactful. And just saw the opportunity. I'd always wanted to come and live and work in Asia since that day in Singapore. And so moved to Phnom Penh in 2000, set up a little professional service firm, and just thought, what role can I play doing the business analytics, but with a different outcome than the client share price chart, I guess. And so that was the start of it. And here I still am a couple of decades later.
Amazing. What an amazing journey. Thank you for sharing it. So let's talk a little bit about now what you do in private equity. My first question to you, Trent, is what are the key characteristics that define the private equity landscape in ASEAN's emerging markets?
I think, selfishly, the first thing is that they're relatively uncompeted. I think in some of our markets, there's literally no one but us. In Cambodia now, there's us and there's a couple of others and a couple of bigger guys from the region looking in, but it's still not too many of us. Even in Vietnam, which obviously has a great thriving private equity sector, in our smaller SME segment, there's still some gaps. So that's part of it. You can do PE and really get to see all the deals. Obviously, the economy's being less developed, although moving fast, provides opportunity both for our industry, but just to do investments that are sort of commercially interesting, but just have an impact by virtue of the development they contribute to. And then I think the other characteristic of this region, I guess, will just be the growing sophistication both of the entrepreneurial class, the regulators and government in understanding the role we and the private sector more broadly can play, and just the improving business environments that come with that. So you just have this situation that's ripe for finding the deals and having good commercial opportunity and having an impact, which is why I moved to Phnom Penh originally.
Yeah. And when I used to live in Singapore from 89 to 96, there were the four tigers: Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia.
Yeah.
But then as ASEAN started to expand, so many more opportunities came up. So my question is, given the fact that you're focused on ASEAN and ASEAN emerging markets, what are some of the unique opportunities that private equity has sees in this region?
Yeah, well, one, I guess, is still in the more frontier side of it than the markets you mentioned. Still relatively limited competition in the PE space, but but also in some of the investable sectors, there are still business model gaps. There are segments that haven't yet been served. The model hasn't yet been developed to serve some lower income segments, some rural segments. So if you can find whichever way to address some of those, there are some really interesting and beneficial commercial opportunities. And I think once here, I think you're either here or you're not in some sense, but once here, you're sort of on what I call this side of the risky barrier. I think a lot of people looking from outside, whether it's upstream LPs, whether it's other investors, the perception of Cambodia, where I sit now, is that it must be risky, it must be difficult. And I think if you're here, it's not really. So the opportunity, to some extent, is being here and being able to invest in businesses, de-risk them, whether that's ESG risk, whether that's commercial risk, governance risk, and then be able to offer up something that's familiar to buyers from outside these markets and say, look, this is what you're looking for that you didn't think you'd find here. So there's that. And then I guess you've got the classic factors. We're in the middle of ASEAN, the borders are coming down, people are moving more freely. It's a 650 million person market. It's growing fast. It's one of the fastest growing regions in the world. The demographics are great. It's young people. It's aspirational. There's aspirational segments, and those business model gaps I mentioned. And then I guess one more thing, if you're upstream as an LP and you want an Asian allocation, but ex-China, ex-Japan, northern parts of the region, then this is an ideal place for you, and we like to benefit from that.
Great response, thank you. And Trent, what are some of the sectors you are currently seeing a significant amount of investment going into?
Yeah, look, I think if you look at, again, the Bain reports, or if you look at the data, I think that more broadly in the region, it's in internet technology and the like, some energy, renewables in particular. But I think and infrastructure. I think if we focus more on our more frontier markets, I think each of those are true in their way. There is technology here. There is renewable energy opportunities. For us, I think it's more around the aspirational sectors, so education, healthcare, innovative financial services, ways to get services to less tapped markets, whether that's lower income segments, whether that's more rural segments, less dense populations. Small infrastructure, niche manufacturing. We have some of the lowest manufacturing costs in the world in these markets. And there's tech, like I mentioned, in the broader region, but it's more about digitization of bricks and mortar and finding ways to serve those segments maybe than brand new models starting up here. But those, I guess, would be the key sectors: renewables and the aspirationals.
So there is a lot of money going into the tech sector in ASEAN. Are you seeing a similar trend in ASEAN emerging markets?
I think the interest is there, and I think there's no shortage of sort of projects around incubator development, accelerators, sort of pseudo VC, if not VC. So the interest's there. I think where the opportunity is maybe greater. I think it's not so much homegrown, innovative new models and stuff, but it's looking at what's worked elsewhere and adapting it. Obviously some of the big regional players, the Grabs and the like, are sort of coming in, but I think it's not so much homegrown tech ideas as adopting models from elsewhere and saying, how can we make electric vehicles work in Laos? How can we make ride hailing and delivery work in Cambodia and the like? So it's an adaptation. And for us, it's more about taking our bricks and mortar businesses in insurance or what have you and saying, how can we use tech to get them to new segments and to deliver new products, and more using it to make better businesses than tech startups per se. Though some are doing it, I guess.
Very interesting. And how important, you referred to ESG very briefly a few minutes ago, but how important are ESG factors in private equity decisions in ASEAN frontier markets?
Yeah. I think it's front and center now. If I trace back, my motivations here since coming in 2000, and the idea was broad, could you sort of do business thinking and have a development impact, and through to raising our first fund, 2009, where the impact thesis, if you like, was if we do no harm and if we sort of have an integrity hurdle about how we do business and do business in the right way, that's already developmental. And that became sort of ESG, do no harm, manage the risks, And that was it. And then through the second fund, that becoming more proactive and more value-adding, if you like. And now in our third fund, I mean, it's absolutely front and center, whether it's gender, climate, addressing the SDGs, and it's specific goals, it's specific objectives, it's measurement, and all the resources that go into doing that. So I think as a sector now, you almost can't separate them. If you want to do the commercial, you have to have the ESG, and the ESG is morphing more and more into what we might have called impact. And I think the two strands come together, which for me is fine because it suits my original motivation for being here.
Correct. Well said. The other question I wanted to ask you was, having spoken to many people, is about exit in ASEAN frontier markets.
Yep.
How easy or difficult is it to implement an exit strategy in ASEAN frontier?
Yeah, and it's maybe the number one question LPs ask us, I think, is, can you get out of businesses? And I think, we've exited everything in our first fund and are working pretty hard on our second. I think our experience would be, really, we've covered almost the whole gamut of modes. As I said, being on this side of the risky barrier, the perceived risky barrier, we have people making buy versus make decisions, and we've seen acquisitions in the sector. We've sold to strategic partners. The markets, even Cambodia, people may think it's a 17 million population, but the markets have got some size and some growth characteristics now that there is room for financial buyers to come in. And we've welcomed some PE firms from the region, a little bigger than us, coming in and looking at our assets, and they have the headroom now to acquire an asset and then grow at that next level that we can't. So financial acquirers, strategic acquirers have both been possible. And then one that perhaps, if I'm honest, surprised us from our first one was MBOs. And it's been one of the impacts that's been kind of exciting to us is businesses that originally came to us because the entrepreneurs weren't bankable. They couldn't raise money, and that was kind of our reason to start a fund. They couldn't raise the money. Now with 3, 4, 5, however years of the governance that we insist on, the audits, the structure that we bring, having us and our LPs in turn as equity shareholders, they become bankable. And so in a couple of instances, we've had good exits from our entrepreneurs going back to the banks or other lending agencies and funding a buyout of us, and we've been more than happy with that.
Amazing.
So the one thing, just to complete the question, when I said almost again, the one thing that hasn't happened so much is listings, and I think that will come, but maybe the regional markets also present an opportunity for some of our bigger businesses.
Yeah, well said. When one looks at private equity, one, of course, is ESG, but another buzzword which is becoming very common is impact investing. What role does impact investing play when it comes to private equity in ASEAN frontier markets?
Yeah, look, I think you can still identify, as I said, it's almost embedded now. I mean, it's almost sort of the right-hand side of ESG, if you think of a continuum. You can still obviously identify impact and philanthropic investors, and maybe there's a question around, is there a returns trade-off, a financial returns trade-off that they make? But I think impact has I almost talk about it one with ESG, has become front and center in our markets. Our markets were, and certainly our first fund and second fund were seeded and developed very much by the development finance institutions who clearly bring policy interest in how we do business and in developmental impact and the like, and obviously a pretty strict regime on ESG. And I think they increasingly, ESG has grown. Our third fund now, our mandate specifically includes how we embed in our investment strategy gender considerations, climate, the broader SDGs, human rights, and setting objectives around those. Now, as I said, I think there's been some more commercial and non-DFI money coming into these markets in private equity now. But I think that the two are still blending. The commercial, if you want commercial LPs, you need to get the ESG right, and increasingly, at least I think more than just at the margin, that means impact as well. So it's front and center to me, and there's no longer quite this dichotomy of you're either commercial or you're impact. You have to be a decent amount of both, I think.
Well said. I also wanted your perspective on how relevant or important are political factors in the ASEAN frontier countries when it comes to making private equity investments.
Well, I mean, I think they can be very, very positive or very negative. You know, in our second fund, we invested in Myanmar. We still have 4 portfolio companies there, some of which are, or all of which are still going, and some of which are doing very well. But clearly, the political situation there and how that drives the economic situation has made it a pretty tough environment to exit, and we can't even put money back into those businesses. So, you know, that happens. You know, if you look at the other side of things, you know, Vietnam's been obviously growing great with the policies in place there. Cambodia has been super stable for us. As I say, people have an undated view of Cambodia and how it must be so risky, but it's been stable. It's had a US pegged exchange rate. It's been very pro-business. And so that environment means, you know, we can do private equity investments with a pretty good amount of confidence. And you've seen the sector developing as well. Well, Myanmar, we actually developed a private equity association a few years back too, to be honest. But also in Cambodia now, there's one coming. The regulators getting more on board and understanding what we do, and so they can have a very positive role. You know, I think even since way back when, you know, as I say, when I went to Cambodia, and PSD was the new acronym, sort of private sector for development. Government, you know, adopts the approach that it can only, and Laos is another example, can only really achieve its developmental objectives by harnessing the private sector. If you've already got that motivation in government, then there's a lot to play with, I think. And if, on the other hand, the motivation is for control and for managing and checking everything, then that inhibits. But yeah, the main role of government and that environment is clarity for investors, I guess.
You know, Myanmar is an absolutely amazing example that you gave me about how huge potential exists, but government is not necessarily so supportive. But do you see a lot of support of governments in some of the other ASEAN frontier markets?
Support to the sector?
Support in the sense that, you know, one is, what is policy like? Second is, if there is trouble, does the government stand on your side? Because you're going in with your money.
Yeah, look, I think the experience is varied, and I think where there are gaps in support, it often comes from knowledge and from us. And I mentioned forming associations that can represent the sector and enable us to better get our views across to government is important. In Cambodia, we have this government private sector forum that explicitly brings the cabinet together with representatives of the private sector, and we have to use those mechanisms.
Right.
So there's imperfection, but you know, whether it's private equity or just the investable sectors, regardless, you know, I think government in general are moving towards, you know, making it clearer for business. They want business to contribute to development objectives, and so getting clarity on the rules, clarity on how you can invest in renewable energies for an individual business, clarity on tax, clarity on how you can move money in and out are all really important. I think the experience is mixed across our markets, but in most cases, moving in the right direction.
Well said. So time for 2 more questions. And I love to ask this question from all private equity investors. Share with me 1 or 2 success stories and 1 story about the one that got away.
If I think of a great success story, was and it's interesting to me because I think not everyone is super supportive of for-profit education, but you know, and some of the sort of more the M&A and activity in our region in that area has been at the sort of expat high-end segments. But we did an investment in a for-profit education business that focused really on the lowest income segment that could afford education. When we invested, they had 3 schools, and I think when we exited, they had 16, 17, or 18 schools, and it was a very good investment for us and educated tens of thousands of kids. It also trained public school management and public school teachers so that the state sector could also develop and improve alongside them. So, you know, that to me was a really exciting proof of concept for private equity and business contributing very directly to development objectives. We have another one which is currently doing very well. It's still in portfolio, but it shows the innovation that and how that can achieve impact as well. It's an employee benefits business that really turns the MFI model on its head and says, you know, can we get wholesalers to essentially through volumes fund consumer finance.
Mhm.
And so that business is able to make products available to low-income segments, particularly garment workers, necessary products and services which they can pay on a schedule with no financing fees. Very exciting business, I think. And okay, we haven't yet, got the exit from it, but I have no doubt that will be a good one. And if you look at the impact side of the equation, very beneficial. If I think of ones that got away, we did a deal sometime. I think it was our very first deal and our very first fund in the internet space. I think ultimately we got out of it and made the best of that. But I think the error there was twofold. We didn't have enough capital to go back into what was a reasonably capital intensive rollout of network equipment, and we kind of bet on the wrong technology, sort of WiMAX versus LTE, I guess it was back in this feels like decades ago. Probably no one even mentions WiMAX anymore. And got the bet wrong, I guess. But they're still going, and they're still a key player, but it didn't sort of realise the objectives that we and they had together for it, and that was just maybe a bit off the wrong thing for us. It's better for us to use tech to help build the businesses we have rather than to sort of bet on tech, I think, at our stage.
What great stories. Thank you. And my last question to you, and this is for a lot of viewers and listeners who will probably listen to you very carefully because of the work that you're doing in ASEAN Frontier. Based on your experience, what advice would you give to new investors looking to enter ASEAN Frontier private equity?
Oh, it's the easiest question because it's the easiest answer because it's the one we're constantly telling our prospective LPs is come and visit. Because, well, just like I originally came and visited and as did my partner, my business partner here, came and visited and got the bug. But particularly, and I use Cambodia as the example, people have just a really, I think, misperceptions of what it must be like to do business here. And I guess they've seen the movies of old times and they've heard the tragic stories. But come here, just come on a holiday, go to Siem Reap, see Angkor Wat. It's unbelievable. You can stay in one of our hotel investments up there. But see it, because I think when people come, they inevitably just see the investability of the market. And I think that would apply to different degrees in each of the frontier markets. And generally, when we've managed to get a prospective LP to come and have a look, the conversation's been very different after to mutual benefit.
Very interesting. And on that note, Trent, and your amazing piece of advice for private equity investors looking at Cambodia or Frontier, come and have a look. And I think that's so simple and yet so difficult for a lot of people to actually go ahead and do that. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. Thank you for giving me such an amazing perspective on private equity in the ASEAN frontier markets. I learned many new things from you today. Thank you again.
Right, thanks for the time.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.